Hello, I've come to the Schiller residence in the middle of Weimar. Friedrich Schiller lived in Weimar and nearby Jena from his late 20s until his death at the age of 45 in 1804. He lived here in this building with his wife and 4 young children during the last few years of his life, and the site has been restored as a very pleasant museum. Schiller was a playwright and poet, committed to the emancipatory values of the Enlightenment. But above all else, he was a historian and historicist. His account of the 30 Years' War is a narrative of weak and indecisive leaders who are captives to circumstance and who lack the courage to act at decisive moments.
"The Emperor is betrayed," said Wallenstein to the messengers. "I pity but forgive him. It's plain that the grasping spirit of the Bavarian dictates to him. I grieve that, with so much weakness, he has sacrificed me, but I will obey."
Nevertheless, the tides of history rise above the inadequacies of individuals and, at the end, are oriented on human flourishing and advancement. Peace prevails at last, and so moves forward the universal history of civil progress.
I've taken a few moments to come over to the Weimar City Castle Museum. This is a Schiller gallery, commissioned by Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna and completed in 1841 with large frescoes painted by Bernard Neher. The bust is a copy of an original by Danica, which is on display elsewhere in the palace.
There are 7 dramatic works representing Schiller's plays spread around the room, including one of Mary Stuart, being comforted by her sympathisers, which was first performed in Weimar in the summer of 1800 and is another example of his focus on historicism. The play is based around the imprisonment and execution of Mary Stuart, who was a rival to the ruling monarch Queen Elizabeth I for the throne of England in the late 16th century. The drama deals with political rivalries and incessant tussles for power and influence. Each of the characters carries their own agenda, whether it's a quest for political ascendancy, or love, or jealousy, yet they're all unified in being governed by that agenda. Their sense of agency is compromised by circumstances. Even the Queen is governed by her place in the world.
She says, "O servitude of popularity, disgraceful slavery! How weary I am of flattering this idol, which my soul despises in its inmost depth. Oh, when shall I once more be free upon this throne?" Mary Stuart says, "At length the wished-for day is come, and what was oft the object of my fondest dreams is now accomplished."
All efforts to be moral are pitiful. Even the priest is governed by the ceremonials of the church. And at the end, even the honest and honourable Shrewsbury conforms, in his case to old age.
He says to Elizabeth cynically, "Pardon, I am too old, and this right hand is growing too stiff to set the seal upon your later deeds."
Schiller is not merely representing history, he's making comment about the place of fateful individuals in that history. He's saying something about the role of each of us in relation to the circumstances we find ourselves in. We aspire to ethical truth, but are governed by our times. Even if we strive to be autonomous and free, in the end it's our mortality that guides us. Even if civilization staggers forward in unrelenting progress, it's not at the hand of individuals that it achieves this.
This is Schiller's reception room, furnished with antiques and paintings. It's a beautiful room, and indeed, Schiller was also interested in aesthetics. He wrote a great deal of poetry that is at one moment frenetic and impassioned, and at the next tender and dewy-eyed, including the Ode to Joy, used by Beethoven in his Ninth Symphony. As a musician myself, it's this aspect of his work I'd like to consider now.
Schiller lived in a world that had not really considered the arts and aesthetics in general to be a serious subject of study until the recent past. Before then, ever since the era of ancient Greek classicism, aesthetics have been associated with sensibility and with triviality, not like the significant matters of rational or empiricist cognition. The first person to treat aesthetics more seriously was Gottlieb Baumgarten in the first half of the 18th century. After periods in Berlin and Halle, he was drawn to the open-minded culture that already existed in Saxe-Weimar at the University of Jena, and, while there, proposed extending the rationalist methods of Leibniz and Wolff to judgments of beauty, which he concluded had to be some sort of judgment of reason. Baumgarten said people reason things to be beautiful based upon a set of rules, and thus he initiated the study of good and bad taste, and the association of the former with beauty. But then the rival empiricists, such as David Hume, refuted the entire notion of rationalism. They argued that judgments of beauty are not reasoned at all, but possess a sense of immediacy. People don't deliberate on matters of taste, they taste matters of taste, which reveals a purely sensory faculty.
Immanuel Kant's achievement was to unite the two arguments and to show how aesthetic judgments can be both immediate and cognitive.
He was the first to argue that the internal structures of the mind cause the sensory component of the aesthetic faculty to be something quite different to matters of taste and opinion. Kant argued that taste is determined by a faculty of desire, which is something quite different to the immediate phenomenal faculty of mind, which is disinterested. He said sensory impressions and the pleasures involved in discerning raw beauty do not desire the thing of beauty. They are not possessive, but contemplative.
Actually, Kant segregated the a priori faculty of aesthetics, not including a posteriori matters of taste and desire, into four parts, which mirror the logical structure he'd already given to the faculty of cognitive understanding.
Firstly, there's a qualitative aspect. Experience of aesthetic properties is immediate, as Hume had argued. It comes before cognitive judgment, and therefore is a disinterested representation. If a sunset is pretty, it isn't because the mind is reasoning from an understanding of the consequences that it's pretty. It's making this judgment before applying any value-laden associations. Consequently, the experience is neutral. Kant argued further that while cognitive judgments use ideas and concepts to refer to objective things in the world, aesthetic judgments do not. They refer back to mental states that are subjective. Consequently, beauty lies in the sensory impression of the beholder. Secondly, there's the quantitative aspect. Kant reasoned that if the sensory experience of beauty is shared by everybody, because people share the same transcendental structure of mind, then it need not be considered entirely subjective. The fact that aesthetic experience is defined universally by the cognitive architecture of thought implies it's a common feature. Indeed, Kant recognized that people know this intuitively and share narratives of aesthetic experience as if they're universal, even though they're subjective. Then thirdly, there is the relational aspect. The existential status of aesthetic judgments is based on the external spatial and internal temporal relations defined by the structure of mind, which in turn reveal a sense of purpose or utility in aesthetic judgments, even when no utilitarian purpose exists. A chair is designed and built as a chair for a purpose, usually for sitting on, and a musical instrument is made for playing music. Aesthetic judgments don't have a purpose in the same way, yet still they reveal to the intuition, by way of the relational aspect of mind, a sense of purposiveness or teleological momentum. Aesthetic judgments reveal a metaphysical teleology, which in turn enables the individual to perceive nature as a symbol of purposiveness and therefore moral goodness. I'll come back to this point in a moment. Lastly, according to Kant, comes a modal aspect of the aesthetics faculty. He argued there's a necessary relation between the perception of beauty and other aesthetic qualities and the sense of gratification and fulfillment. Aesthetic judgments, by way of the cognitive structures of the mind, result necessarily in feelings of pleasure or otherwise. The essential subjectivity of the experience means that this is not a transcendental or practical necessity, nevertheless is to be considered as necessary to the subject. According to Kant, the four aspects combined enable the aesthetic faculty to act as a mediating principle able to unify the involuntary a priori components of cognition with the practical components of mind that enable reason through understanding and thereafter free judgment. They reconcile the predetermination of mind and its essential free will.
This is Schiller's study, and no doubt he read Kant's third critique in here, the critique of judgment. He agreed that people are not only thinking and acting beings, they're also feeling beings, embodied in the emotive currents of life. But he was not entirely convinced by all of the older man's arguments. Specifically, he was not satisfied with Kant's division between matters of aesthetics and taste, which implied a division between aesthetics and ethics. Schiller argued that art must reach beyond the raw aesthetic and assume a moral dimension, although not in a manner based on the privileging of reason or a Kantian duty-based categorical imperative. Instead, it must utilize the sense of freedom that comes with the autonomy of spirit to stand up against the despotism of societal orthodoxies, the soul-destroying conventions placed on art by the political and ethical establishment, and against an intellectual acquiescence to the rigidity of natural law. It must place aesthetics and qualitative judgments above matters of epistemology and metaphysics, not treat them as a measly afterthought.
Furthermore, Schiller was dissatisfied by the division made by Kant between dependent and free aesthetics. Dependent aesthetics is associated with objects possessing utility, such as a charming chair or a sonorous horn, whereas free aesthetics does not involve any object possessing utility. For instance, a pretty flower perceived as pretty in and of itself and without reference to its natural function would represent free aesthetics or free beauty. Kant had said that, given all human activity is essentially utilitarian, the ideal of beauty is only to be located in natural phenomena, although this could include the beauty of a human figure, provided it's represented as free of expression and signs of the cognitive process, and able to be perceived in a disinterested fashion. Schiller disagreed vehemently and addressed the issue in his On Grace and Dignity. He said that it isn't possible to represent a human figure free of its thinking mind. Human figures represented as art can't be separated from their moral conditions, such as grace, which is to be associated with women, and dignity, which is to be associated with men. He said both of these and all human expression possess inherent moral content, which is why they're treated with different aesthetic representations. Actually, Kant had argued that when nature is observed as possessing beauty, it's as if it possesses a teleological will encouraging constructive cognitive judgment, which in turn supports the rightful place of morality in the world, natural laws and mental powers in perfect balance. Kant had posited that the teleological purposiveness of beauty reveals the place of morality to subjective understanding. An individual's exercise of taste transfers both to the empirical world and the moral realm. Even if aesthetics and ethics are separate faculties, the former could shape the latter.
However, Schiller had been on a roll and managed to overlook this. He rejected the significance of the disinterested immediacy of perception. He said an aesthetic judgment always implies a moral position. This is a true state of the human condition. He refuted the separation of free and dependent aesthetics and the placement of the ideal of beauty beyond the realm of art and poetry and a life of virtue.
His On Grace and Dignity is, in effect, an indirect rejection of Kant's moral theory rather than his aesthetics, arguing for greater moral significance than by a deontological categorical imperative alone. Schiller continued with the same theme in his Letters on the Aesthetical Education of Man, where he wrote, "Moral beauty comprehends two distinct elements, equally beautiful, justice and charity. He's arguing that it's the essential unity of aesthetics and ethics that defines the values of civilization. Schiller didn't only make his argument through formal academic accounts. He presented his ideas through poetry. He aspired to compose verses of ideal beauty that might elevate the spirit, but also reveal the moral and political conditions of his times.
This is a room where Schiller greeted his friends and acquaintances. He would have told them that moral reason and aesthetic judgment must work together. Schiller said that the experience of beauty enables the unity of reason and sensuality to become humane. Aesthetic judgment leads to moral action, and moral action expresses itself aesthetically. Art is a process by which humanity comes to comprehend its necessary autonomy. Art reveals a path of moral enlightenment and self-improvement, a path that could never allow for the brutality of the French Revolution.
Since Schiller's time, there have been many other endeavours focused on fusing moral reason and aesthetic judgment, in particular in the visual arts. I'll look at the work of Bauhaus artists in particular in a later episode, including the work of Lionel Feininger. But it's worth recognising now that a great deal of the 20th century art that strove to represent moral worthiness aesthetically utilised many and varied versions of what moral worthiness might mean. From National Socialist propaganda posters, such as Youth Serves the Führer, to the Stasi equivalent, Youths Forward. I've been on a roll too, but I'll finish where I started with another passage from the music I played at the beginning of this episode. This is an orchestral piece written by me, which has its own revolutionary theme. It's called Ritual of Ascendance. Thanks for listening.